Welcome back to Juvenile Justice Policy, CRJU 303A. Today we'll be discussing the purpose and scope of juvenile courts. Today's learning objectives are to recognize the purpose of juvenile court acts, to be able to distinguish between the adult and juvenile justice systems, to understand how the juvenile court accomplishes its purpose, and to recognize the concepts and various categories of juveniles included in the scope of juvenile court acts. The first Juvenile Court Act in the United States was passed in Illinois in 1899, and by 1945, every state had enacted its own juvenile court legislation. These acts generally authorized the creation of a juvenile court and granted legal authority to hear cases involving delinquency, neglect, abuse, dependency, and other categories specifically listed in the statute. A typical Juvenile Court Act outlines both the procedural and substantive law governing juveniles within that jurisdiction. Historically, these laws were administered with an emphasis on rehabilitation and parental concern rather than punishment. This philosophy is reflected in the wide variety of purpose clauses states include in their statutes, some expressed in great detail and others describing only broad goals. Juvenile court proceedings were originally designed as civil rather than criminal matters, a distinction rooted in the reformers' efforts to clearly separate juvenile courts from adult criminal courts. As part of that effort, a unique terminology developed to reflect the rehabilitative mission of juvenile courts, a nomenclature that continues today despite periodic calls for harsher responses to serious offenses. These purpose clauses help clarify legislative intent in a complex area of law, and most states include at least one overarching purpose clause for their juvenile courts, with some adding additional clauses tied to specific types of adjudication or to the agencies that administer the system. Over time, purpose clauses have shifted in response to changing priorities, research, national trends, court decisions, and model legislation. Some states reflect newer philosophies, while others retain earlier approaches. The progression of these clauses can be understood along several historical categories. Some states have no statutory purpose clause at all. Others reflect the early parens patriae philosophy, which emphasized the court's protective role over children. As juvenile justice reform expanded during the 1960s and 1970s, many states adopted purpose clauses shaped by due process requirements imposed by federal law and Supreme Court decisions. In the 1990s, some states incorporated the principles of balanced and restorative justice, emphasizing accountability, community safety, and competency development. More recently, purpose clauses in some states follow a developmental approach, explicitly referencing adolescent development, research, evidence-based practices, or other data-driven methods to guide decision-making within the juvenile justice system. When we compare the adult criminal justice system to the juvenile justice system, one of the first differences we notice is the language and tone used in each process. Instead of filing a grand jury complaint, information, or indictment that charges a defendant with a crime, the juvenile process begins with a petition that alleges a young person may have committed a delinquent act. Rather than moving into a criminal trial followed by a sentencing hearing, juveniles take part in an adjudicatory hearing and, if needed, a dispositional hearing. The entire structure is designed to focus on the interests and needs of the youth, which is why juveniles are not found guilty, but may instead be adjudicated delinquent. Underlying these differences is the long-standing idea that everyone working within the juvenile justice system is expected to act in the best interest of the child. Of course, people disagree about what the best interests look like in practice, and over time, states have tried to create more consistent definitions and procedures. One major effort to encourage uniformity across the states led to the development of a Model Juvenile Court Act, which reinforced the core philosophy that the system exists to support the care, development, and protection of young people. Even though the system was built on these ideals, there has always been debate about whether the state can meaningfully fulfill this parental role. Stories of system failures appear regularly, reminding us that the promise of care, guidance, and protection does not always match reality. For this reason, many argue that we should continually re-examine how well juvenile justice agencies actually support the youth they serve. Beyond these structural and philosophical differences, the juvenile system is guided by several recurring themes. It aims to shield young people from the stigma of criminality, replacing punishment with treatment, training, and rehabilitation whenever possible. It emphasizes keeping juveniles within their families unless separation is truly necessary for their safety, and it seeks to maintain a straightforward, fair process that will still respect their constitutional rights while accommodating the unique needs of the young people. Each of these themes shapes how the juvenile justice system operates and how it continues to evolve. When we consider how the juvenile court works to accomplish its intended purpose, one of the first issues that emerges is the system's effort to reduce stigmatization. For many years, states defined delinquency so broadly that relatively harmless misbehavior and far more dangerous conduct were swept under the same label. Over time, most states revised their juvenile codes to narrow those definitions, but the line between typical youthful mischief and genuinely harmful behavior is not always clear. Because that line is so subjective, we continue to see situations in which very serious offenders benefit from an overly generous rehabilitative approach, or, conversely, situations in which youth engaged in minor misbehavior are treated as if they were hardened delinquents. Both extremes illustrate the central challenge facing reformers: how to avoid labeling juveniles who do not warrant that label while still holding truly dangerous youth accountable and protecting the community. It is a tension that juvenile courts across the country have grappled with since their creation and continue to confront today. Another major component of the juvenile court's purpose is its commitment to maintaining the family unit whenever possible. The underlying belief is that children should remain within their families unless remaining there poses a real threat to the child's well-being or to public safety. Determining when removal is necessary, however, is rarely straightforward. Child protective workers and the courts generally proceed with caution, intervening only after a thorough review of the family environment and after efforts to support the family have failed, or when the situation is clearly harmful. Even when removal becomes necessary, the court may treat it as temporary, with a possibility of reunification if conditions improve. While most people agree that preserving the family is usually the right goal, there are cases in which doing so places the child at continued risk. In those situations, the emphasis on family integrity can become so strong that it delays or prevents action that would better protect the child. Alongside these goals, the juvenile court is always responsible for ensuring that juveniles receive the constitutional protections they are entitled to in legal proceedings. Earlier models of juvenile court relied heavily on informal hearings and broad judicial discretion, often with minimal attention to evidentiary standards or procedural safeguards. Modern juvenile justice, however, requires formal recognition of due process in adjudicating delinquency. If a youth is alleged to have committed an offense, the evidence must support that allegation, and the adjudication must rest on proof beyond a reasonable doubt. An adjudication based on a juvenile's attitude, peer group, or family circumstances, rather than on evidence of the act itself, would violate both the spirit and the letter of those protections. Although informality still plays a role in some stages of the process, particularly when the court is determining disposition after adjudication, the fact-finding stage must meet the same rigorous standards of fairness that apply in other areas of law. Taken together, these elements reflect the broader purpose of the juvenile court: to promote the welfare of youth, to safeguard their legal rights, and to intervene in family life only when there is a sound and necessary reason to do so. The system aims to balance protection, accountability, rehabilitation, and fairness in a way that serves both the young person and the community. Some common concepts included in the scope of juvenile court acts include age, the delinquent acts itself, deprived, neglected, or dependent children, jurisdiction, concurrent, exclusive, and blended jurisdiction, and waivers. In the Uniform Juvenile Court Act, A child generally includes anyone under the age of 18, along with some young adults up to age 21, whose conduct or procedural posture places them within juvenile jurisdiction. Although each state sets its own boundaries, the basic idea is that unlawful behavior committed before the 18th birthday is handled as delinquency rather than crime. The emphasis is on providing a response that avoids criminal stigma and instead focuses on treatment, guidance, and rehabilitation. States largely follow this model, though they vary in how they draw their lower and upper age lines. Most states treat 18 as the point where childhood ends for legal purposes, meaning acts committed before that age fall to juvenile court, while acts committed after are processed in the adult system. Even so, exceptions exist. Some jurisdictions allow youths aged up to 21 to be transferred back into juvenile court when circumstances warrant, giving them access to the protections, procedures, and rehabilitative aims of the juvenile court system. Conversely, youths under 18 who commit particularly serious offenses may be transferred into adult court, though this requires meeting strict statutory and procedural guidelines. Across the country, many states have raised the upper age of juvenile jurisdiction in recent years, shifting 16 and 17-year-olds into the juvenile system instead of the adult system. These changes reflect a growing recognition that preserving young people from the adult justice process promotes public safety and improves long-term outcomes. Even after the age of adulthood, many states allow juvenile courts to retain jurisdiction long enough for a youth to complete an existing disposition, often extending supervision to the 21st birthday. States also vary widely in where they set the lower age of jurisdiction. Some identify a clear minimum age for delinquency, while others rely on common law presumptions that very young children cannot form criminal intent. This creates a patchwork in which children as young as 6 may be brought into the juvenile system in some states, while others leave the matter to judicial interpretation. Similar inconsistencies appear in defining when a child may be considered abused, neglected, or dependent. As with delinquency, many states offer broad discretion to courts and agencies, leaving substantial room for interpretation. Taken together, these variations reflect the long-standing challenge of balancing child protection, accountability, developmental realities, and the need for consistent and fair juvenile court procedures. The Uniform Juvenile Court Act establishes a clear and limited definition of delinquency, defining a delinquent act as one that constitutes a violation of local, state, or federal law. Activities such as incorrigibility, ungovernability, habitual disobedience, and other status offenses are excluded from delinquency, as these behaviors are offenses only applicable to children and not adults. Prior to the Uniform Juvenile Court Act, many states used a broader definition of delinquency that encompassed a wide range of behaviors. The drafters of the Act narrowed the definition to focus only on violations of laws applicable to both adults and juveniles, reflecting the legalistic trend of the late 1960s. While this narrow interpretation excluded certain non-criminal behaviors from the delinquency category, it did not remove these behaviors from juvenile court jurisdiction entirely. Historically, some states considered children who were beyond the control of their parents, habitually truant, or habitually disobedient to be delinquent. Over time, however, the number of states with such broad definitions has decreased. A key difficulty in including vague behaviors in the delinquency category has been the lack of standardized definitions and the resulting legal challenges on the grounds of vagueness. Even before the Uniform Juvenile Court Act was drafted, some states had begun restricting the definition of delinquency to acts that would be criminal if committed by adults. In New York, for example, the pre-1962 Children's Court Act included ungovernability and incorrigibility in the definition of juvenile delinquency. With the 1962 Family Court Act, non-criminal status offenses were placed in a separate person in need of supervision category, while juvenile delinquency was defined more narrowly to include only children between the ages of 7 and 16 who committed acts that would be crimes if done by adults. The adoption of this more specific definition led naturally to the development of due process procedures, rules of evidence, and constitutional protections for juveniles. The trend toward a narrower definition of delinquency also facilitated a more formalized adjudicatory process, ensuring protection of juveniles, procedurals, and constitutional rights. Some states now list all forms of conduct under juvenile court jurisdiction in one general category. Section 2.3 of the Uniform Juvenile Court Act emphasizes that an adjudicated delinquent is considered in need of treatment or rehabilitation. The narrowing of delinquency definitions and the formalization of due process procedures are not intended to diminish the court's rehabilitative mission. This principle, first articulated in 1909, maintains that the goal of the juvenile court is to develop the child into a responsible citizen rather than to punish. The philosophy of treatment and rehabilitation was reaffirmed in the Supreme Court's In re Gault decision, which highlighted that the procedures from apprehension through institutionalization should be clinical rather than punitive. At the same time, the juvenile court retains a duty to protect the community from unlawful or violent acts, which may sometimes require incarceration. This dual responsibility has been described as the schizophrenic nature of the juvenile court system, balancing rehabilitation and public safety. The majority of states have moved toward a more narrowly defined delinquency, standardizing legal definitions and focusing on violations of the criminal code. Evidence used to prove delinquency must now meet standards similar to those in adult court, rather than relying on broad social information about the juvenile's family, peers, or environment. Juvenile courts must work within a legal framework to determine the truth and serve justice, ensuring that adjudications are based on evidence rather than assumptions about the juvenile's environment. Consideration of the family and home environment remains important, but is appropriate only after delinquency has been established, not as the basis for adjudication. Prior to the Gault decision, cases often relied heavily on social investigations rather than proof of delinquent acts, leading to inconsistent outcomes. Today, due process and constitutional protections are central to adjudicating delinquency. Section 2.4 of the Uniform Juvenile Court Act defines an unruly child as a minor who is habitually truant, habitually disobedient, or ungovernable, or has committed an offense applicable only to children, and who is in need of treatment or rehabilitation. Historically, many states categorize these behaviors as delinquent, which sometimes led to institutionalization. The Uniform Juvenile Court Act recognizes that while such minors may require intervention, they should not be labeled delinquent. Unruly children cannot be placed in correctional institutions unless they are found, after a subsequent hearing, to be unamenable to previous treatment. Unruly children generally commit non-criminal or minor violations known as status offenses, including curfew violations or running away from home. Many states now separate unruly children and other minors in need of supervision from juvenile delinquents. The creation of these categories allows courts to address non-criminal misbehavior while providing flexibility and options that avoid the stigma of a delinquency label. Nevertheless, terms such as unruly or in need of supervision can still carry a stigmatizing effect if the juvenile becomes formally involved with the court. Most states provide distinct procedural standards for unruly children, including using a preponderance of the evidence in adjudication rather than the higher standard required for delinquency. These distinctions also extend to disposition options and upper age limits. The classification of unruly or non-serious violators reflects an understanding that early intervention may prevent future delinquency, although some unruly children may have more intense behavioral or emotional issues than certain delinquents. The categories are intentionally broad because non-criminal behaviors are difficult to define comprehensively, and the term habitually distinguishes recurring patterns of misconduct from isolated incidents. In some cases, behavior described in petitions as unruly may reflect neglect or inadequate parental supervision. Family circumstances, such as a crisis, can lead a juvenile to rebel, resulting in behavior that appears unruly, but is precipitated by environmental factors rather than innate criminal tendencies. The distinction between delinquent and unruly children allows the court to intervene appropriately, while maintaining flexibility to address the underlying causes of the behavior. Section 2(5) of the Uniform Juvenile Court Act defines a deprived child as a person under the age of 18 who lacks proper parental care or control, subsistence, education, or other necessities for physical, mental, or moral health, provided the deprivation is not primarily due to the parent's financial limitations. A deprived child may also be one placed for care or adoption in violation of law, abandoned by a parent or custodian, or without any parent, guardian, or legal custodian. Different states use varying terms to describe similar circumstances, such as dependent child, deprived child, or neglected child. Some states, like Georgia, break these definitions into specific categories, excluding children receiving adequate care through recognized religious practices. Other statutes, such as Illinois, include specific provisions for abused children, covering scenarios such as destitution, living with neglectful or cruel caregivers, or engaging in street work at a young age. Juvenile court acts often provide special provisions for children under a certain age who are abandoned, lack parents, or are without adequate care or supervision. For instance, Georgia defines dependent children as those abandoned by a parent who fails to provide sufficient food, clothing, or shelter. Ohio includes children who are homeless, without adequate care due to parental incapacity, or living in conditions that place them at risk due to abuse, neglect, or dependency, affecting siblings or other children in the household. Although the Uniform Juvenile Court Act excludes financial hardship alone as a basis for deprivation, some states address severe neglect where parental resources are mismanaged, endangering the child's well-being. Courts distinguish between neglected and dependent children primarily based on the presence or absence of parental fault. Across all statutes, these circumstances exist through no fault of the child, and juvenile courts are tasked with providing appropriate remedies and protection. Jurisdiction refers to the authority of a court over persons, behaviors, and relationships, as well as the geographic area in which the court may operate. In juvenile courts, jurisdiction determines the court's legal power to hear and decide cases, and it is created and defined by state juvenile court acts. A distinction exists between a court's inherent jurisdictional powers and its discretion to exercise jurisdiction over a specific case. For instance, a juvenile court may have exclusive jurisdiction over delinquency, unruly children, dependency, or neglect cases within a specified age range and geographic area, but jurisdiction is only properly exercised when a petition is filed and the respondent is adequately notified of the allegations and proceedings. Some states have expanded jurisdiction through family court acts, which allow courts to address adoptions, divorces, custody, support, mental health issues, and certain intra-family criminal offenses. Adults who abuse or neglect children are usually prosecuted in criminal courts, but juvenile courts may intervene to remove children from unsafe homes and provide protection services. Age is a key factor in determining jurisdiction. While most states do not specify a lower age for delinquency, 16 states have set minimum ages, commonly using the common law age of 7. The court generally requires the child to have sufficient capacity to understand the act and its consequences. Upper age limits for delinquency, unruly children, and children in need of supervision are also established by state law, but states vary in their approach. Some consider the age at the time of the offense, not apprehension, in determining jurisdiction. Section 2(1) Romanet 3 of the Uniform Juvenile Court Act allows individuals under 21 who committed a delinquent act before turning 18 to remain under juvenile court jurisdiction. States may set different upper age limits for delinquency and other categories of juvenile court cases. For example, Texas defines a child as 10 years or older, but under 17 for delinquent conduct, and 17 to 18 for acts committed before age 17 that indicate a need for supervision. Illinois sets the upper age for delinquency at 17 and for dependent or neglected children at 18. The Uniform Juvenile Court Act recommends an upper age of 18 for all categories of juvenile court jurisdiction. The issue of whether juvenile courts have concurrent or exclusive jurisdiction is generally determined by state legislatures and defined in each state's Juvenile Court Act. Section 3 of the Uniform Juvenile Court Act grants the juvenile court exclusive jurisdiction over certain proceedings, meaning it is the only tribunal empowered to act and other courts are deprived of authority in those matters. In some states, concurrent jurisdiction exists, allowing both the juvenile court and criminal court to hear certain cases, such as specific criminal acts. Typically, the court that acts first exercises jurisdiction. Juvenile court acts may also address jurisdiction over adults who encourage minors to commit offenses. In some states, juvenile courts share jurisdiction with adult criminal courts. In others, adult courts have exclusive jurisdiction. Determining whether jurisdiction is exclusive or concurrent requires reference to the specific state's Juvenile Court Act. Concurrent jurisdiction can create complexities, so statutes often provide for waiving jurisdiction in the best interests of the minor or community. Blended sentencing is another form of shared jurisdiction, allowing juvenile and adult courts to impose both youth, correctional, and adult sanctions on certain juveniles. Blended sentencing may be exclusive where the judge imposes either a juvenile or adult sanction immediately, or inclusive where a juvenile sanction is imposed alongside a suspended adult sanction contingent on future behavior. States typically limit blended sentencing by age and type of offense. Research indicates that youth receiving blended sentences are often similar to those transferred to adult court, but are younger, less of a public safety risk, and more receptive to rehabilitation. Blended sentencing provides incentives for juveniles to avoid adult court transfer while offering judges more flexibility in treatment and sentencing options. Juvenile court acts generally give juvenile courts original and exclusive jurisdiction over cases within defined age and subject limits. However, these acts also provide for the waiver of jurisdiction, transferring certain juveniles to adult criminal court. Waiver policies differ by state and include discretionary, presumptive, and mandatory waivers. Discretionary waivers allow judges to decide, often in cases involving serious or repeat offenders. Presumptive waivers establish statutory criteria favoring transfer, but allow juveniles to argue to remain in juvenile court. Mandatory waivers require transfer once statutory age, offense, and prior record criteria are met. The waiver process is distinct from concurrent jurisdiction, which occurs when two courts simultaneously have authority over a case. Terminology varies by state and may include certification, bind over, transfer, or decline, but the purpose is the same: to move a juvenile from juvenile court protection to adult criminal prosecution. Waivers are critical because juveniles lose the parens patriae protection of rehabilitation and may gain a criminal record and exposure to adult offenders. Some states, under statutory exclusion provisions, automatically transfer certain juveniles to adult court for specific serious offenses without a juvenile court hearing. All waiver types are generally tied to minimum age, seriousness of the offense, prior criminal history, and in some cases, the use of a weapon. Judges must often find that the juvenile is not amenable to rehabilitation or that public safety requires transfer. Discretionary waivers are often subjective, relying on the judge's assessment of the juvenile's suitability for rehabilitation and the best interest of society. Prosecutors in some states can also directly file charges in adult court, known as direct file. Waivers must comply with the constitutional due process protections. The Supreme Court in Kent v. United States in 1966 held that juveniles are entitled to a full hearing, legal counsel, access to social records, and a statement of reasons for the transfer. Many states have incorporated these procedures into their juvenile court acts. States often provide statutory guidance on factors to consider, such as the seriousness and premeditation of the offense, age, prior delinquency, culpability, availability of juvenile treatment resources, and whether a deadly weapon was used. The waiver decision balances the interests of the minor and public safety, recognizing that transfer to adult court may result in a felony record with lasting consequences. Juvenile court judges typically waive jurisdiction only for serious or repeated offenses, ensuring that minor or isolated acts are addressed within the juvenile system. The Supreme Court in Breed v. Jones, 1975, further clarified that the Fifth Amendment's double jeopardy clause prevents a juvenile from being prosecuted in adult court for an offense already adjudicated in juvenile court. A clear understanding of juvenile court acts is essential because the court's goals cannot be achieved without them. Their purpose is to protect juveniles' welfare, preserve the family, and safeguard the public. Balancing these interests can be challenging. For example, detaining a repeat offender may protect society but disrupt the family and affect the juvenile's well-being. Understanding the scope is also critical. Law enforcement, prosecutors, and judges must know age limits, juvenile categories, jurisdiction, and waiver procedures. Juvenile court acts define which cases the court can hear, outline procedures, and aim to serve both juveniles and society, though conflicts sometimes arise between public safety and the juvenile's best interest. The Uniform Juvenile Court Act narrows delinquency definitions, emphasizes accountability, and protects juveniles while preserving families. Consistent with recommendations from national commissions, most states have removed non-criminal status offenses from juvenile court jurisdiction.